With us right now, with Peter and I right now, is Rob Avis, and we are going to talk about cold climate rainwater harvesting considerations. I know that we've mentioned it briefly both in module 3 when we talked about site layout, and we also talked briefly about cold climate rainwater harvesting considerations in module 5 when we were talking about roofs and gutters. But I really wanted to do one lesson where we bring all these different considerations together and talk about the challenges with cold climate rainwater harvesting. And so, welcome, Rob.
Hey guys, great to be here.
And Peter, I know in Australia, surprisingly enough, you actually have some experience with some cold climate rainwater harvesting.
Not as much as you guys. So
Yeah.
welcome, Rob. Yes, I've had design experience in our snowfields with cold climate rainwater harvesting. So, but you guys would be immersed in it, I suspect.
Yes, except for I would say that there's still a lot of room for innovation and research, just given that there's not a lot of great examples of cold climate rainwater harvesting that we've seen. So with that, I want to say if you live in a climate with a winter cold enough to freeze any standing water, that's what we mean by cold climate rainwater harvesting. I've often seen Rob and I joke about we see things like the cold climate permaculture book where it's England. England is kind of considered a cold climate, possibly compared to Australia. So we kind of laugh. It's like we're the very, very cold climate where water will freeze.
In fact, for the people in the US, we live in a place where Fahrenheit and Celsius become friends at -40. So it does bring a whole bunch of different considerations. And both Michelle and I are originally from the oil patch. And so the engineers in Canada generally are trained about everything cold climate and how it affects buildings and how it affects pipelines and how it affects the expansion and contraction of everything. And given that we're in a continental climate, we're even more extreme than some of our other climatic bioregions, such as the West Coast or the East Coast. And so we literally just came out of a cold snap where we reached -37 degrees Celsius here in Calgary. It's 8 degrees outside right now. And in the summertime, it can get as high as +35. So we have a really large spread of temperature because of the nature of a continental climate. And Michelle's probably gone through this in the class, but the other kind of extreme that we deal with is a very low rainfall. And so we actually have a really high evaporative force here because we are continental and on the verge of a desert, basically. Not as high as Australia. But one of the interesting things to look at is when we look at evaporative force relative to precipitation. And so a third of our annual precipitation actually comes in the form of snow. And we live in a really unique climate in that, and pertains more to landscape rainwater harvesting, but it could still potentially affect how we get rainwater into tanks. But when we're driving down the highway and we have a 60 or 70 kilometer an hour wind coming from the mountains and there's snow blowing across the prairie, I often think, we're in one of the only climates where small little elements placed on the landscape can dramatically change the amount of water your property can receive on an annualized basis. And if you get into some of the avalanche literature, what's really interesting is that when snow moves and then settles and forms, and it forms a cornice or a solid structure, something that you can actually stand on, there's about 50% of that volume is represented as liquid water in the form of ice, obviously. And so snow can amount to an enormous amount of water. And when we're limited to 300 to 320 millimeters of water per year in rain, that extra 100 millimeters to 150 millimeters equivalent in snowfall can make all the difference in being able to get through that long dry period where most people wouldn't be harvesting rainwater necessarily. But it does pose some interesting challenges.
So let's dive into that, Rob. What are the key considerations that a designer looking at rainwater harvesting system has to consider for the design of a cold climate
Yeah, so I mean,
system.
you guys have done a really good job of kind of going through the rainwater system, following the drop from the roof down to the tank. So maybe we'll follow the same process there, just to kind of keep some consistency. Hopefully, we're using roof surfaces that are going to be able to hold the snow for a period of time, and so snow can add up and be quite heavy. It's different than in rain, in that rain will actually flow off the roof as it hits it. We can end up with these massive amounts of snow on the roof, and so if we're actually going to be or designing our roof systems to be able to harvest this frozen water, we need to take that into account right at the beginning. So
as you're designing your roof,
right, absolutely. And so a lot of times in these northern climates, you see these funny shovels. In fact, we have one for our farm, which people use to basically shovel the snow off of their roof. Which is counterproductive if you're trying to harvest rainwater. And so if you want to keep that snow on your roof, which may not be feasible in some environments, like the town of Revelstoke, for example, I think gets over 20 or 30 feet of snow per year. So that'd be like almost 10 meters of snow at an extreme. So having
unless maybe you were planning on melting it on your roof.
Yeah, maybe. But
okay.
I mean, when we're talking about that kind of volume of snow, the design consideration from a structural engineering perspective is going to be to shed it as quickly as possible, because trying to design beams of that magnitude is going to get very expensive very quickly. And so that's going to transition the conversation from trying to get that snow into a tank into let's just make sure it stays on the landscape and find a way to put it to productive use later in the season when it melts.
So, Rob, we discussed that with some of our snowfields design I was involved in here, where the roof structure and gutter structures were actually altered so you could harvest the snow,
Cool.
because there's a structural engineering constraint unless you're ready for it. So, and there was a range of different design solutions came out of that. One of them was no gutters and very steep roofs, and your snow is actually conveyed as it becomes snow melt at a near ground structure. So one of the others was actually a substantial. This is in our snowfields in Australia. A substantial support from a very steep roof into something that doesn't look like a roof gutter at all. It's actually like a half round pipe that's on columns that flows down into your rainwater storage, because it's relying on storing in snowmelt. But those design considerations depended on the snow depth and the capacity of the roof structure and building to actually hold the weight. So in areas where that potential weight on any day of built up snow is moderate, the designs were to actually keep the snow in the system and rely on the slow snow melt process, because we, as you pointed out, we need the snow. Snowfields are the same as in Canada. If you didn't actually harvest the snow, you wouldn't quite make it for rainwater harvesting. But where the snow dumps are substantial, but not as substantial as you guys, they're allowing it to fall in different roof structures straight to the ground and caught in a near ground conveyance structure. So.
That's really brilliant. So you're suggesting that almost like a half round pipe might be 4 or 5, I'll use meters, 1 to 1.5 meters above the ground, and it will capture that the snow sliding off the roof. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's exactly what we did, Rob.
That's really cool.
So because of these issues you're talking about, you can't discount the structural engineering impact of this, the weight of the snow.
Absolutely. Yeah, so one of the only examples that I've seen done of this, although the institute that I'm working at right now has the ability to do this, and Michelle and I are contemplating this on our new farmhouse. But the earthship community in New Mexico, because of how dry they are and how most of their moisture actually is also in the form of snow, actually put some small heating grids underneath the house, and they were just powering that off of solar, which again, there'd be some calculations to see if that actually made sense to do that. But that's one of the only examples of an active melting system. We don't really need that here in Calgary because we go through these Chinook cycles where we'll get, a 20 or 30 degree Celsius temperature swing over a 24-hour period of time. And so in our bioregion, we can just rely on that Chinook coming in and allowing us to harvest that rainwater. But where they get deep freezes for longer periods of time, one of the things I've been contemplating is if you're going to use a steel roof, there may be ways, while we do get cold in this environment, we get a lot of sun. And so there may be ways to actually harvest waste heat on a building or on another surface and actually blow it underneath the roof to melt some of that snow as well, to capture it. And I don't know if I'm a fan of these yet because I haven't studied them enough, but the institute that we've got actually has a built-in eaves trough. My immediate reaction to it when I learned about it was that I'm not actually a huge fan of these built-in eaves troughs just because of potential drainage plane issues and toxic mold and all that stuff. But one advantage that I've noticed with them is that they tend to be very effective at harvesting kind of snowmelt. So with the airspace underneath that roof, we have the ability to discharge waste heat through that cavity and then pick those up on the internal gutters. So that's a slight variation. I think I like your system a little bit better if you've got the area around the house to be able to capture that snow, or the building or the commercial building, whatever you're referring to.
So, Rob, I'm glad you mentioned the heating as well, because one of the intermediate solutions that has been tried here and it's working is actually warming the roof. So
right.
We don't have much snow and we're mucking around with these things. So I think that's quite ironic. So, Rob, it's quite interesting you mentioned those things. There's a middle ground where if the snow weight is not substantial enough to cause, massive alarm with your structural engineering constraints, you could actually increase the snow melt just by a little bit, so you get your build up is not as substantial on your roof, and you got runoff more consistently into your rainwater storage. That was sort of the middle ground. It's also been experimented with in our snowfields. But I think what they've used is like in a large electric blanket, Rob, where you've got these hot water coils running through the roof surface. So
yeah, I've been contemplating using, and I think this is going to be dependent on kind of your ecosystem and what resources you have available to you. But evacuated tubes work really well up here, and they'll put out almost 2 kilowatts of heat, even in the dead of winter at -30. And so once your domestic hot water needs have been met, you can potentially redirect the water, because you need to dissipate that heat in a snow melt effort. But one thing that I really like about the design that you brought up, Peter, was because it addresses one of the main concerns or issues that we have with this cold climate water harvesting is conveyance. So there's the gutter piece or the eaves trough, and so those tend to get blown off the roofs if they're not set back, and if you set them back too much, or set them down, then they don't collect rain in the springtime, because the water just kind of passes by the eaves trough. But the second thing is that our vertical and horizontal conveyance tends to freeze up, and so all of our downspouts are actually made out of corrugated aluminum. And the reason they do this is so that they have the ability to expand and contract with freeze-thaw issues that we've got here. And so it's not uncommon for our northern or downspouts on the northern aspect of our house to just freeze solid, and there's no ability to convey that water. And so having a potential electric element in there, or an internal a downspout might be an option, but your option's even better because we can allow that freeze thaw to occur. We're not having to worry about eaves troughs getting blown off roofs, and it works in both the spring and in the winter
You're
time.
talking about the large trough like
down near the ground.
system, Rob?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Rob, the only thing with that design is we had to convince, because it was, for a chalet. So, it was a public use facility with, hundreds of people going every day. We had to convince our local health department that not having gutters, not having downpipes, and having this trough arrangement closer to the ground, we're still going to be safe. We were able to, but we had to have a stronger conversation about that, because their argument was because it's closer to the ground, there's more potential for access to, other sorts of contamination.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so there's a lot of little constraints and considerations there, and so if you're in this class and you're kind of in a cold climate,
and you want to harvest rainwater year around, right? Like, if you can, there's always the option of only having a seasonal system and shutting your system down for the cold months. But this lesson is about diving into trying to collect snow in the wintertime, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I think it comes back down to, and we kind of touched on this a little bit in the book. Is probably the part that we were really drawn to kind of flesh out further, but was this concept of holistic design. And so when we look at the greater landscape requirements, there, it might be suitable to find another way to use that snowmelt on the property and still, gain value from it. One of the concepts that we're looking at right now for another client is a pondless waterfall, which will not be for potable use. It'll primarily be for landscape use. And so it's a kind of totally different use for the water. And then, in that point, that type of a system it's a lot easier to capture the snow and not worry so much about contamination, because it's a totally different type of system. But yeah, what I was going to say is that it's good to go around in the wintertime, go for walks. I get made fun of sometimes as being kind of a backyard creeper, because I'll walk down back alleys and look into people's backyards or into people's front yards and just like look at how ice and snow interact with different buildings relative to different aspects, relative to different parts of your city or your community or your rural location, because you can get a lot of pattern information around what will and what will not work. And I do rely very heavily on my trades, even though they're not necessarily doing this to harvest rainwater in tanks. They have an enormous amount of experience with dealing with the complications of ice in terms of conveying it away from the house. And so if you ask the right questions of your trades, they'll give you a lot of insights with regards to how to get it to where you want it to be. It's certainly an area that, while I have some experience in, it's one that I want to do a lot more research in my current position at SAIT.
So, Rob, we're both rainwater stalkers then. My partner Janine accuses me of walking around all these streets and checking out whether or not people have got rainwater harvesting and how they're doing it and what sort of state of repair it's in and what their gutter looks like and whether or not they've got permaculture type things. We call it water sensitive urban design over here. And we'll all catch up one day and we'll share some stories.
Mm-hmm. I want to direct the conversation to another type of gutter system that I've seen is these removable gutters, especially in cold climates, where Rob, you mentioned earlier this issue in cold climates where you have to kind of set the gutter the right way, the right position, so that you're capturing rain when it rains, but you don't want to stick them out too far, because then when the snow load lands on them, they rip them off. And so that's where one of the outcomes, or something that's quite common, especially in heavy snow areas, is removable gutters, and people are taking their gutters off. Are there alternatives for people who want to move into, harvesting water year round or not removing their gutters. And one last thing, I think those removable gutters, you can't use the is it the extruded gutters? You have to really use the PVC versions to be able to get them up and down, right?
Well, theoretically, you could take the steel or aluminum ones down. So if you're gonna have a metal roof, and the reason that metal is because if it's an asphalt roof, you don't really have to worry about snow sliding off of your roof. But on a metal roof, what people will tend to do if they don't want to remove gutters and they've accommodated for the snow load, as Peter was mentioning, they'll put snow rakes on. And you either love snow rakes or you hate them. I haven't found any nuance in that belief system amongst engineers and trades. The people that hate them all claim that they get ripped off because the load is too high, which means they probably don't have enough snow rakes to hold the sliding load of the snow. And the people that love them like them because they don't have piles of snow forming around their house, and they just allow their roof to kind of accommodate that extra load. So that facilitates not having to remove those gutters if they're properly designed and installed. One other thing that you guys have probably already addressed in the course, but and again, this is another conversation with one of my trades, are these gutter guards and how horrible they are. And so one of my trades, when I was talking to him about it probably 3 years ago, was saying he said it just moves the problem 3 inches higher and it rots out all the sheathing. And you can imagine that having these gutter guards on your gutters, in some ways it might prevent them from getting ripped off because there's a smooth surface and the snow can kind of keep going across the surface. You've now got this mass of material that, as it thaws and melts, is going to potentially wick moisture up into the roofing membrane and cause mold and rot issues.
We did talk about that, Rob, how the second generation gutter guards have accounted for that, but not all the manufacturers have got second generation gutter guards. So you need to be very careful about that. Because I'm really bad at cleaning out leaves from my gutter. So I've been doing rainwater harvesting for forever, and the plumber has got the worst plumbing in the street. So my family forced me to get the gutter guards, but I wouldn't get them because of that very issue you've highlighted. So thanks for underlining that again. I ended up with some second generation gutter guards. They're different in their design and they don't have that problem you've discussed. But I think there's a point there, Rob, that we need to underline that's relevant to this wet, cold climate discussion as well, is you still have to clean these things.
Right. Yep. And then you got this nasty thing to remove to get in there. Not to mention, with all the research that you've done, Peter, around UV treatment, and maybe this, I'm not sure if I've seen the second generation ones, but you negate the ability for the sun to get to the bottom of that. And what's interesting with the eavesdroppers I've talked to is they any kind of accumulation of debris in those gutters, especially if it's not properly sloped, you end up with galvanic action going on, and it doesn't take very long to, just given the redox potential of aluminum to corrode through the gutter itself.
Yeah, we were talking about that, Rob, where if you allow leaves and other sorts of debris to decompose in your gutter will corrode.
Right.
Because of, as you're talking about, all the acids are created in the decomposition cycle.
Mm-hmm.
The new breed of these gutter guards actually don't allow anything into the gutter, but
cool.
I'm more referring to what might get trapped at the interface between the roof and the gutter guard. It's moved the problem up the roof, as you were talking about, Rob. So this new generation gutter guard I've got has resolved most of that, but my finding is you still need to actually clean these things every now and again, or else all you're having is if there is a build-up somewhere on your system, on the roof rather than in the gutter, you're still creating those acids will create decomposition of your roof materials.
Right. Yeah.
Following the drop through the gutters and down the downspouts, I'm thinking of one of the next areas that we've noticed poses another challenge for cold climates, which is the downspout filter.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're probably familiar with graph, Peter, but and not that it has to be a graph filter at all, but one of the nice things about the graph tanks and their take on the rain head is that they actually can integrate it into the tank. And so while that can pose challenges from a servicing perspective, having this below grade allows us to get access to the free thermal energy from the earth.
And just back up a tad, Rob. Describe what we've noticed happens to the downspout filters if you're not redirecting water. You'll see in some of the diagrams in our book, we have a diversion valve, basically a little specialty valve that goes right on the downspout, and there's a little flap that you can redirect the water to in the wintertime. And the odd time that we've kind of forgotten to switch that valve in time, we've noticed ice buildup on the downspout filter, right?
Yeah, totally. And then you've got the mass loading of that ice. You basically end up with a little climbing structure for your children if they've got ice shoes.
Downspout filters are not very strong, Rob, so you're probably just breaking it. So, especially with children hanging off of it.
Yeah, and that adds up. The Australian ones, which we get up here, are $70 a piece. So, which is why I wrote you that email 3 or 4 years, probably 2 years ago, maybe it was last year, I can't remember now, about 3D printing them up here, but that's another conversation. So with the mesh screen on there, that screen will get cold. The water is already close to freezing if it's and it will just freeze right over, and so it kind of negates and so I guess an area of research that could happen up here would be to see if those screens are even required in the middle of winter when we don't really have the kind of debris floating around our environment. And I don't have an answer to that yet, but and maybe there's an argument to just get rid of it entirely. But
no, Robin didn't take the course.
Hey, Rob, you have to do our course.
Well, but in all honesty though, like with if there isn't a lot of debris floating around in the air, there's no bugs and there's no rodents, up at that area. Like I'm just wondering, like, do you think that it's still going to be capturing stuff in the middle of winter?
You'll be surprised what is there, Rob, and your downspout filter, as you guys call it, leaf diverter, leaf beater. They've got all sorts of names. Our research has shown us the most effective way to actually protect your rainwater quality. And you'll be surprised what's in the atmosphere.
Right.
And what blows onto your roof from somewhere else. So we had this discussion with a chap recently. He said there's no trees or anything within half a kilometre of his house. He doesn't need any mesh screens or leaf diverters, downspout filters as you guys call them, or anything like that. It'd be fine. Ended up having to empty out his tank because all of the decomposing leaves and debris in the bottom of his tank. And he said, where did that come from? It's the atmosphere actually provides these things. And rainwater harvesting's become very much aware, rainwater harvesters become very much aware of these things.
Right. So, I mean, I guess that's where making the case then, if you're going to be collecting the snow, that's kind of where I like where Graph has gone with this, moving the filter below grade, and taking advantage of that free geothermal heat, if you're not going to be providing additional thermal energy for melting those screens, essentially.
Yeah, it's a really good thermodynamics point. You still want liquid to flow through those screens to take out anything that might be there.
Right.
In theory, the snow would, before it gets into snowmelt phase, would bind up anything else that might be there, leaves, twigs, sediments, etc., Rob. But water quality and cold climate harvesting is an interesting issue we could discuss. May not be here because I think the snow probably helps you.
Why do you say that? I'm curious.
Because obviously snow is a different phase of water, and because of that phase, the solid phase, it's actually holding, combining whatever else is blown with it.
Right.
And so what's happening is you're relying on this snowmelt slower process to put water in your storage. So the stuff that will flow more easily will flow towards your rainwater storage during a snowmelt event, which is the water. And the other types of potential contaminants, like leaves and debris that might have ended up in that snow dump, are going to be a bit slower to end up in your system. So I haven't got an answer here, but I've just got a suspicion that's a completely different water quality paradigm in a snow melt rainwater harvesting situation.
Yeah, perhaps the crystals are acting almost a little bit like a coarse filter or something like that.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, Rob.
Interesting. Yeah, I could totally see that. I once read an article about the high concentration of deuterium, so heavy water in snow, and that plants actually really prefer it. And it's interesting, this is totally an aside, but the Inuit of the north only drink melted snow water. They say it gives them extra energy.
In theory, Robert, it'd have more nutrients in it. I agree with that. So what do you think?
I don't know. Yeah, it's something I've been thinking about myself. As I'm getting older, I should probably start drinking a bit more snow.
I got 20 years on you, mate.
So, gentlemen, back to the downspout filter. Do we need to put some heat tape on the downspout filter? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, so what I've been thinking about, and I haven't done a lot of this just because it's, so I do have a cold climate rainwater harvesting system south of Calgary that we've been monitoring. And luckily the downspout filters are on the south side and there's good sun there. And so they do get regular thawing action going on. And then as long as the conveyance piping underground, this is interesting because there's a crossover here to the septic industry. But as long as the conveyance piping has really good drainage, so a positive 1.5 to 2% grade, and there's no real solids in the material, in the water, I should say, and I'm speaking about septic effluent right now, and then we'll come back to rain, we tend not to get ice buildup in pipes. And so, even though these challenges that we've mentioned exist, this particular home has got the snow rakes, has got big gutters, has got a shallower roof, they've got big beams, and they're still managing to collect or supplement their rainwater with, supplement their potable water, their household water with snow. I think that in some climates that are unlike ours, where we don't get Chinooks, I do think that having some sort of a melting function, either from a photovoltaic array or the grid or a solar thermal system using evacuated tubes, is probably not a bad idea if you're really wanting to optimize that water. And ultimately, it'll come down to the model that you guys have shown all the students how to use, and if that extra snow is really going to make or break them. And in some climates, it probably is, and in some climates, it might not.
That's a really good point about whether it's worth the effort. I think Michelle and I and the students have been playing around with a Vancouver example, and the snow part of precipitation is quite small relatively.
Mhm.
But I think if we drifted over to, say, Ottawa, the snow part of participation will be quite dominant. So
Mhm.
I think that's a modeling perspective. Can I raise another point, Rob and Michelle?
Yeah,
Passive design will be quite important here. Even when it's really cold, the the sun has strong potential energy that's applied. So you mentioned putting downpipes and so on on the southern face, which would be your hot face, and north face is our hot face.
right.
Um, I think that's probably something that should be considered, a passive design function for cold weather design.
Mm. Mhm.
Absolutely. And I mean, you can take it a step further, just to kind of build on that point a bit, and even consider the kind of colors that you're using. So using a white downspout's not going to have as much thermal gain as a black one. And so when you were considering, it's interesting how much color plays into these high performance buildings.
So this
There's this
is,
trend, right? Go ahead.
sorry, Rob, sorry. You're talking about the albedo effect.
Absolutely, the albedo. Yeah. And so as Canada moves towards these high performance buildings, where we're getting, R50, basically, think of this, and it's crazy. I can't believe my country still uses imperial and metric, always going between the two. So 45 centimeter thick walls, to get the kind of performance that we want in the building. The color of the building still has an impact with regards to whether we have a cooling load, which is crazy for a cold climate like ours. And so albedo is a very powerful force, and we can have a lot of influence on this concept of passive design by not just placement, but also the color.
Absolutely. And color is important. I remember having a conversation with a chap at a coffee shop one morning, explaining that color was a very important design choice, and I got laughed at. So it's these little things we overlook that are quite important in this situation.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And so then when we get down, sorry, go ahead, Michelle.
No, I think we're going the same direction. You going
Okay.
onwards to the tank because that's following the drop, the
Yep.
direction I was moving to.
So when we get to the tank, and this is actually one of the more challenging pieces, even though we've already talked about a lot of challenges, is that we have to, there's a number of factors that we have to think about when we put a tank underground, if that's in fact how we're going to store this water. There are some manufacturers in Alberta here that store water for oil field purposes, and they keep the water from freezing just by putting an air stone in it, which to me is a little crazy, but because if the air stone fails, then you've got big problems. But
Hey,
um,
Rob, do you want to just describe what an air stone is for our students?
yeah, so they'll just put a small little regenerative blower, which is now not passive anymore. We're consuming electricity, which has to come from somewhere. And it's equivalent to putting a sump pump in your basement. And if you've watched any of my YouTube videos, you'll know how I feel about that. And they drop an air line to the bottom of the tank, and then they put an air stone in, and they get this constant circulation of water. And as long as the water is circulating, this is actually how they keep the Great Lakes from freezing in marinas, is every boat that's parked in the Great Lakes has an air stone underneath it, and that prevents the boats from getting frozen into the ice. And so we can do the same thing in our rainwater tanks, but now we've got this constant use of energy. So there's a couple of considerations that we have to think about when we go below grade, which will allow us to gain the benefit of the free geothermal heat at the expense of digging that hole. One is the buoyancy of that tank. And so we have to think about, we're basically submersing or putting a submarine underneath the ground. And some tanks accommodate this just in the shape of the tank, and others actually require us to put ballast or dead men at the bottom of the tank, not actual dead men, but concrete blocks. And so we have to think about where our groundwater level is, and the buoyant force that's going to impose on the tank. And then the other thing that can be really challenging if you are on a site that doesn't have a lot of relief or topographical variation is how we manage an overflow scenario from a tank like that. So if your property is on a bit of a hill, we can manage that overflow because there's enough room for the water to actually go somewhere. And I can maybe draw this on the Zoom panel if that's helpful. But if you're on a really flat area, dealing with that overflow can be a bit of a challenge, maybe forcing you to actually have to dig another hole somewhere else and putting in a dry pit. And so just all the same ideas apply with regards to tank design, but now we've got the ballast issue. We've got in our climate, this is something that blows a lot of people away, but our frost line consistently goes down 4 to 6 feet a year, or that's like 1.5 to 2 meters. And sometimes when we get up to Edmonton, it's actually almost 3 meters deep, which means that you can either submerge your tank below that frost line. So you got to dig 8 feet down just to get below the frost line. And then you've got to dig another 6 or 7 feet just to put the tank in. Or if you refer back to the rainwater harvesting book, you can do something called a shallow insulated foundation, and just by projecting insulation over top of the tank, we can actually modify the frost line in the soil so that we don't actually have to put the tank so deep, which is typically what I recommend. Now, just one more point on that. That usually means we're putting expanded polystyrene under the earth. And while EPS is actually fairly good as far as foams go from an environmental perspective, still not my first choice. And it turns out that ants really love to eat this stuff. And if that EPS gets wet, they will start to honeycomb it. And then that can create freeze thaw issues for your tank below. And I actually have a friend who lost a tank this way. So there's all these challenges that start coming when we start putting tanks below grade that we kind of have to premeditate a little bit.
But on the other hand, there are people doing this, like the septic industry, for instance.
Absolutely.
They're constantly putting tanks below grade. So there is knowledge and there is expertise and there are trades who can help you think through the challenges and for your particular area.
Yep.
So definitely reach out. I don't know, Peter, do you have any experience with below grade tanks that tied to this? Mm-hmm.
In my country, if you could put in an above ground tank, the below ground ones are not recommended. So basically, because of a range of problems. But I'm glad Rob mentioned buoyancy, because even a lot of engineers don't understand buoyancy. So you need to be very careful with buoyancy. It's most problematic when your tank is empty, and you need a lot of counter weight at the bottom of your storage, which is usually, in this country at least, a lot of concrete. And we should have learned about buoyancy from the swimming pool industry, because you get, say, in the city of Sydney in Australia, you get a number of swimming pools every year pop out of the ground because the people have not understood the buoyancy effects that go on. So it's you've got an extra order of magnitude of complexity as soon as you go below ground, which is okay as long as you know about it.
I definitely want to make sure, and I don't want to move topics unless if you have more stuff to say about below grade tanks, but I want to bring up the situation in my grandmother's home, where she had in her basement a built-in cistern into the wall, and it was almost a concrete room with some sort of a liner, and that's what they used for rainwater year round. And so, let's talk about this idea of integrating the tank into your home, because that saves you possibly having to dig another hole if you were going to dig a hole.
So this is a really interesting point, Michelle. When I was over there working with CMHC, so many Canadians come forward and said they bought this old house and that rainwater cistern was actually built into the bottom of it. And it's an ancient Egyptian idea, so, thousands of years old. uh, probably one of the original rainwater harvesting ideas is not this separate storage, it's just your basement of your house. So, um, and it's come to the vogue here in Australia too, where um, they're excavating out an area to make the footings of the house and so on. And that's quite a plan area, and excavation is expensive. So rather than putting all the soil back in and putting in all sorts of buffers and everything else they do in the bottom of the house, and you guys have basements, they're actually putting masses of rainwater storage in as the house is being built here. But what I found compelling, especially when we started doing our workshops with CMHC around Toronto area, and people were coming in and saying, "Oh no, we have these old houses that got the rainwater harvesting facility in the bottom anyway."
Yeah, no, it's people had a lot more, and I mean, that was the way to develop back then. I know that Michelle's grandmother stopped using that cistern when they tied into municipal water, which is, I think we've had that conversation already, Peter, offline at some point, and how, or maybe it was one of the articles, the many articles that I read. People start getting lazy when they tie into the grids.
Or I think they were even just told, they were convinced that it was cleaner, safer, better water than municipal water, to be honest.
That's what happened here in Australia. Water companies have got to make money, and they're monopolies. We usually dance around this, but I'm too old to dance around it. So and a lot of good citizens were convinced that it'd be safer to actually use and pay for this water that's supplied to them. And this was the paradigm in Australia. And during the Millennium Drought, there's a whole bunch of people almost took a class action against governments because then they were required to put back in their rainwater harvesting systems to help with water scarcity. So, it's a conversation for another day, but different eras we've gone through, and how people were convinced to do things that they probably shouldn't have done because of someone's interest is a dominant conversation in the water industry, I believe. So I probably accept Michelle's version of that, Rob. Yes, it's easier, but even the surveys we did in Canada when I was there, a lot of these people were actually talked out of using these things on health grounds by an authority who wanted to sell them water. So I found that quite ironic.
Yeah. So if you were lucky enough to have an old house like grandma's that, was set up at one point in time to have a room in the basement to harvest water, the same principles we've taught throughout this course would apply in terms of the design practices that you could use to feel really comfortable with the quality and use quality, correct? Any other different considerations if you had a room in your house?
I think you need to, from a structural engineering perspective, you actually need to consider the travel of moisture through walls and so on. You'd have to actually the interface between where you're storing the rainwater in your house and where you live. You'd want to make sure you've got a fairly waterproof membrane in place, because you'll get this moisture seep through the structural areas around that's storing the water. So you probably, the only additional issue, Rob, what do you think, is to actually account for that?
Yeah, I think your point on structural is really important, because you got to make sure your footing is water's heavy, obviously, so you want to make sure that your footing is substantial enough to carry that. One other thing, I have a client in Regina, and Regina is built upon an alluvial gumbo, like a very expansive clay, and to the point where when they get heavy rains, the gas lines that are below grade disconnect from the houses, because they're literally pulled out of the foundation because of the heave in the ground. It even gets worse than that. They have a whole industry there dedicated to lifting houses, cutting off the 2x4s or the walls, because the walls are getting pushed up as a result of the gumbo applying pressure to the footing of the basement. It's really expensive. And so if you were going to be integrating, like Michelle's grandmother's tank was an integrated tank made out of cinder blocks and painted with tar on the inside, you'd want to make sure that you weren't in a situation or in an area where there were expansive clays that had this massive expansion and contraction going on. And so I have seen other installations where when the house is being built, that they're actually gonna, they put a tank down there, or even potentially another option. I know that in Australia there's tanks that can come flat packed on a skid, and you assemble them out of a combination of corrugated metal and steel beams, and then you use a proper liner on the inside, and that would be a little bit more resilient to the kind of cracks and movement that we can see in our basements.
Yeah, they build them that way, Rob, so they're actually resistant to movement, because everything on Earth moves. So,
right.
But I made a slightly different point. The movement of moisture through walls into living spaces is something you need to consider. So you sort of hit on that a little, Rob, when you said there's a tar liner. I would sort of want to avoid a tar liner.
I would too. Yeah. I kept wondering how much of that water Michelle's mom had consumed.
So we won't get into the family history now, guys, but but you do need an impermeable membrane on the walls that are shared with living space.
Absolutely. Yeah. The other funny thing with that tank too is it had no lid. And so, there was all sorts of evaporative forces happening there. And I think
it made a great indoor swimming pool. My mom tells us. So they can climb up the wall, scale up the wall, and go for a swim.
Yeah.
Sorry, Rob.
No, I think the saving grace was how leaky the buildings were back then. But as we move into these high performance buildings, we definitely have to be very cautious of toxic mold and high humidity, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think, in this lesson we've outlined some of our thoughts, some of the things we've seen, some of the constraints, and what you need to consider for cold climate rainwater harvesting. I know this is an area that Rob and I are really excited about, especially as we're transitioning to a new place. We are really trying to figure out how we can do some of this stuff, and we'll be for sure reporting and sharing our design process and our thoughts and what we come up with for our own home. So, continue to follow us on our YouTube channel, and over the next couple of years, we'll be sharing lots about what we're doing. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Any other final thoughts, gentlemen, on cold climate rainwater harvesting? All that all the way through.
None from me, except for it's great you're calling us gentlemen. So
gentlemen. All right. Thank you so much, Rob, for joining us. That was really, really fantastic.
No, it's wonderful to be part of the course, and I've been watching it kind of unfold, and I'm excited to listen to all the recordings that you guys have put together. It is definitely it's been great to watch the whole progress unfold. And Peter, many thanks for being engaged, so engaged in the program. This wouldn't happen without you. We're ever grateful for all the knowledge that you're sharing with the world, and it's wonderful to be rowing alongside you.
It's been a pleasure, Rob, and since I've taken this job as head of department at a university, Michelle's got up close and personal with my EA. So I'm rounded up by two organised people. As you know, Rob, I'm creative. I'm not very organised. So when this is finished, I probably won't have any structure.
But you'll get some sleep and some weekends off.
That's right. Too right.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
See ya.